Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong. Our book today, A Deadly Secret, the bizarre and chilling story of Robert Durst by Matt Birkbeck. We're going to talk to Matt in just a moment, but I want to thank our sponsor, audiobooks.com, for underwriting Good Books Radio. I want to tell you that if you want to hear this particular interview again, you can get it on our Facebook page, Good Books Radio, or on our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio. No doubt you've heard over the past few weeks about Robert Durst and the saga of trying to track down what they believe to be now a man who is a mass murderer. There is, of course, the HBO documentary called The Jinx, which has caused quite a stir in social media and other places. And so we're going to interview Matt Birkbeck today, who was one of the first people on this story back in 2000. And he also was interviewed for the HBO documentary and declined to appear on it for what we might call artistic or content differences with those producers. So we're going to talk to him about his book, A Deadly Secret. Let's go to him now. Welcome, Matt Birkbeck. You were consulted for the HBO documentary, right, Jinx?
I was asked to. The director, I had met with him a couple of times. He asked me to interview. He and I had spoken about Durst for years. He was interested in my work on it. Mm-hmm. So we had spoken before. I declined his invitation to appear. He had a different vision of Bobby Durst than the one that I was more familiar with, so I just politely declined.
So you provided some sort of background research through discussion, but you didn't want to go on camera.
Well, he had read my book back in 2005,
I see.
And we spent hours talking about it, so he was familiar with my work.
And obviously Robert Durst was familiar with your work, right?
Yes, he was. 2 copies of the book were found in his Houston condo, so that was a bit of a revelation.
How did that make you feel? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I was surprised when I first heard about it. I had gotten an email from a producer from one of the network morning shows who said, "Hey, they found 2 of your books in his condo." So initially I was surprised, and then the more I thought about it, the more it made sense, and that the book does provide a roadmap into his life and some of the more bizarre things he had been doing long before these new investigations surfaced. So I'm sure he kept it as a reference.
Well, my producer, Renee, who's here close by, told me that he saw the HBO documentary, and he got the feeling that they had information that perhaps should have been shared earlier, but they held it in order to maximize publicity for the documentary. Anything to that? It
sounds like the letter. There was a letter that they did uncover. It was the one bit of new information that they did uncover. A letter that tied him into the murder of Susan Burman. Apparently, they held on to that for a bit, but they did turn it over to law enforcement, I think 2 years ago. And then there was, of course, the last few minutes of the documentary in which Durst himself is heard saying, is involved in this bizarre rant with himself. He's heard saying that he killed them all. I think that was subsequently shared with law enforcement. So, I mean, there were some issues with what the producers did, how they presented it, how it was out of sync. Some things didn't make sense. Some facts they played with. Some were just wrong. But at the end of the day, with that little bit of audio with Durst announcing that he, had killed them all, that was more than enough to get everyone talking about him.
Do you think he's schizophrenic?
Well, I write in my book that he was diagnosed at the age of 10 with having severe psychological problems, and I also reprint the letter that was written to his family, warning them that unless he's treated, this could result in what he called a severe psychodynamic force that could lead to a personality decomposition. And it went left untreated, and but we saw it manifested later in his adult life with a number of things that he had done. So is he schizophrenic? I don't think so. I'm not a psychologist. Does he have a multiple personality disorder? It's a good question. But whatever he has, he's had it for a very, very long time, and it's clearly played a huge role in his life.
When I started reading your book, as I told you before we went on air, I was telling you that all I knew about the case was Robert Durst, and his wife disappeared a long time ago, and it took a long time for that to kind of catch up with him because he wasn't prosecuted early on for her disappearance. And was he not prosecuted because he was rich?
He wasn't prosecuted because all they had was circumstantial evidence. And back in the day, back in the early to mid-1980s, you needed more than that. Mm-hmm. And the detective on the case, who, as I write in the book, did a lot of work, unfortunately for him, his name is Mike Struck. He was portrayed in the Jinx as being a bit of a buffoon, or mm-hmm. had performed poorly in his investigation. You know, he did everything he can to try to get the prosecutors to indict him, but unfortunately they just couldn't. They didn't have a body. They didn't have any tangible evidence. All they had was circumstantial evidence. Today, you can convict someone on some very strong circumstantial evidence. Back then, you couldn't. So, in addition, his family could have done more given their standing in New York, their mm-hmm. wealth, and their influence. They didn't. They basically went into the shadows and let Bobby Durst fend for himself. And mm-hmm. he was able to basically withdraw into the shadows and remain there for roughly 17 years.
Well, I think the thing that struck me as I was reading your book about the original investigation by Struck is that, he started throwing out his wife's things within a matter of days of her disappearance, behaving as a man who had written her off, so to speak. Said, well, good riddance. That was odd.
Clearly they had uncovered a lot of really interesting circumstantial evidence. I mean, your wife goes missing, you don't start, or a loved one goes missing, you don't start tossing away their personal items, mm-hmm. Unless there's something more to it. Unfortunately, they had that. They had the Kathie Durst friends talking about how she had feared for her life. They talked about the beatings mm-hmm. that she had endured from being married to Durst. They talked about how she was seeking a divorce. Unfortunately, as the prosecutor said, you put it all together and it's not enough for us to indict him. We could indict him, they said, mm-hmm. but given his family connections and his wealth, mm-hmm. it would be very difficult to convict him. So that's primarily the reason why they didn't move forward.
And then they were afraid that even if they went to court and lost, that and they couldn't bring charges later when they could build a better case because of the double jeopardy rule, right?
Correct. That was a major concern for them, too. They had always hoped that other evidence would surface mm-hmm. That would give them a much stronger case. And so that was something that they had to consider.
Well, when I was, as I told you before, when I was reading the case, all I knew about was that first disappearance, and I didn't know about the killing in Galveston at all, and that was, really gruesome. That was the work of a serial killer. So, do you think he's a serial killer?
When I originally started covering this story, I thought it was one in which somewhat typical story of a man who is accused of killing his wife but isn't prosecuted, and then ultimately, justice is served. When Mars Black was murdered, I went down to Galveston, and the first thing that the police told me, the detective told me, was that whoever did this knew what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And then when I combine that with what I also disclose in the book, and that is how just prior to all of this going on in 2000 and 2001, how Durst had for years been living this bizarre life, crisscrossing the country, living surreptitiously and mingling with the homeless and transients and stealing numerous identities along the way, mm-hmm. and at times dressing as a woman. And then when you add in the fact that he knew how to dismember a body, that's when I began to believe that this was a far more disturbing story than just the prototypical husband kills wife and gets away with it story. That's when I started to think, my God, this guy could very well be a serial killer. So I believed it then, and my belief in that strengthened over the years. And given what I saw at the end of the Jinx on HBO, it was, I wasn't surprised. It was, that was my feeling all along.
Well, one of the other elements that helps him fit the profile of a serial killer is that he killed his dogs, or at least they believe he killed his dogs, right?
That was something else that had been told to me, and it's in the book. He had 6 or 7 Alaskan Huskies, and he named each of them Igor along the way, and one would die, and he'd get another one, and they died these mysterious deaths. So I guess, there was a recent revelation where police are now, they're looking at him as a serial killer, and they're looking across the country now to try to connect him to other cases. Police in Vermont are looking at him now in a case that goes back as far as 1972.
Because he had a health food store there.
Yes, right. And she disappeared. She was a customer there, and and an hour later, she's across the street waiting for a bus, and she disappears into thin air. So I had thought that his bizarre behavior, didn't begin until Kathie Durst. Now, you have to question that, given what he did do to his dogs, and if this story about the Vermont teenager or college student actually leads to something even more, then you have to think, God, he could have been doing this
a long time.
In the 60s. Yes, a very, very long time. So hopefully, as I mentioned, the FBI has been involved for 3 years now, and as they had announced just 2 weeks ago, they're looking at him across the country, and they're looking at missing person cases in cities in which they can identify where he's lived in and see if they can in some way connect him to other missing persons.
But even through all of this, his family obviously managed to get him a lot of money under the table, right?
Well, his family, he's been estranged from his family for a very long time. They've been terrified of him. They know him. They know who he is. They remember him when he was younger. So particularly his younger brother, Douglas. Douglas, over the past decade, for instance, whenever Bobby would come to New York, Douglas would have his security people follow his brother around 24 hours a day, which I write in the book. So, he had a trust fund. The family basically paid him off after the 2003 trial. They said, here, take your $60-something million and go away. We don't ever want to see you again. And so he's been, for the most part, he's been estranged from his family, and he's increased his worth to roughly $100 million since then. Which is also another part of the equation here. It's somewhat dangerous in that you're talking about a guy with his bizarre behavior with an awful lot of money. A lot of money.
Well, like you point out that when they arrested him in Galveston for the gruesome murder of Black, it was, right? And
yes.
So when they arrested him, he had a bail of $300,000, I think it was. And
it was a large bail.
And then he met it the next morning. So where'd that money come from?
They were shocked when that happened. What he did was he's married to another New York realtor by the name of Debbie Chariton, and as one of his many defense mechanisms, when he learned of this new investigation in 2000 into Kathie Durst, he marries this woman, Debbie Chariton, knowing that if he's ever charged with a crime, that she, as his wife, could bail him out. And that's exactly what happened. So when they locked him up in 2001 for the Morris Black murder, no one ever thought given what they thought he was, they thought he was just some transient, like Black was. So when he made bail and disappeared the following day, everyone was shocked.
So the Black case, they found someone found his body or a part of it floating in the bay, correct?
They found his everything but his head in several garbage bags floating in Galveston Bay. Correct.
And then when they went to the apartment, all they got a report was that this guy was killed, lived in one apartment, and then across the hall was Durst. Except they didn't know it was Durst. It was a woman who was allegedly he was living as a woman as a deaf mute, right?
Correct. He was living as a woman named Dorothy Siner. That's how he had rented the apartment. And at the same time, he had also rented another apartment in New Orleans under the name of another woman, Diane Winnie. So he had two apartments there between Galveston and New Orleans. So, but when they went there, they found to the apartment, they were able to find identification with the name Robert Durst on it. So that's what led them to him.
And then I like, you have a wonderful scene, just like the best of novels, where they come in and they find that it's not very clean, and they suspect there's blood, and they bring in the luminol, and it just lights everything up. There's blood everywhere. It's a powerful scene.
Yeah, I mean, that was somewhat graphic, but also, clearly he spent some time disposing of Morris Black's remains. And then again, I'll go back to what the police told me and what law enforcement testified at his trial, and that is, you have to know what you're doing to dismember someone. It's just not something you can just do. You have to know where to make your cuts and how to make your cuts. So that's probably the one big mystery in this case, and it's probably the most disturbing one, and that is, how did he learn to do that?
Yeah. And then is it your belief that this is what happened to Kathie?
Yeah, it is actually. There was, as I write in the book, the Tuesday after she went missing, or the Monday night into the Tuesday, the neighbors saw this strange blue light in the basement or crawl space of the country home that he lived in with Kathie Durst, and it had been on for several hours. So the only question, though, is, did he have help? Some people believe that Morris Black had helped him with that, going back to 1982, or was this something that he had already learned even then in 1982 and had done to Kathie?
Well, there is another element here that is real bizarre, is he sells that house and then he has them rent it back to him for 3 months. And that's very odd.
And it was, and he apparently slept on a cot down by that crawl space. So, police have been to that home a number of times, and they've gone through it. And so my understanding is that they have found blood in the house. And as I write in the book, there's some other blood evidence. The problem is that was it just, was the result of a murder, or was it the result of an accident, at some other point in time? So it's unclear. So I think if they would have had something of great value, then they would have used it, and they would have charged him already in the Kathie Durst disappearance / murder. The fact that they haven't, leads me to believe, also with talking to my law enforcement sources, that they just haven't been able to come up with that one big piece of evidence that they need.
Well, right now he's in Louisiana, correct?
Correct.
And it's too bad they didn't arrest him in Texas, because then he could get the death penalty.
Well, it's an interesting way of looking at it. He's facing, he's in New Orleans, and my understanding is that law enforcement, particularly the FBI, they're fine with that, and they hope that he stays there for a while. That'll give them an opportunity to take a breath and continue on with their examination and looking across the country to see if, in fact, there are any other potential victims out there. And it's also going to give the prosecutors in Los Angeles additional time to shore up their case. I'm certain that they believe they have a pretty solid case, or else they would not have charged him.
Oh, yes.
Given the resources he has to hire the best attorneys in the land. So, but I don't think we'll see that trial in the foreseeable future. I think he'll be in New Orleans for a while.
Well, actually, the Black case. Am I confused, or was he tried for that?
He was tried for that, and he was acquitted.
Yes. How the hell does that happen?
That's another good question. That's one of many in this case. It was a combination of him having some very good attorneys in Texas, of some very poor prosecutors in Galveston, and then you've got this jury, this bizarre jury that somehow saw this case differently than everyone else who did, watching it across the country. So they subsequently acquitted him, and I know that left a lot of members of law enforcement in Galveston, from the judge on down to the detective, scratching their heads.
Well, he claimed self-defense, right? He claimed self-defense.
He did, but it was, given the evidence that they had, that was the only thing he could do, was claim self-defense. So I think a competent prosecutor would have been able to argue that or argue against it. Unfortunately, I was there, and I hate to say this, but they weren't very good, the prosecutors there in Galveston. So they weren't really able to combat what the story that the defense presented. They weren't able to poke any holes in it, and there were a lot of holes that they could have poked. They just didn't do it. So it left the jury in their minds with no other decision other than to acquit him.
I don't know. I mean, it just boggles the mind. Your defense is, well, I killed the guy because he would have killed me, and then I cut him up, to hide everything because I didn't want to tell the police about it. That's my defense. I mean, I can't. It just boggles the mind that would sell.
It boggled a lot of minds.
I'm sure it did.
It continues to boggle a lot of minds today.
Can't help but think money was involved there somewhere. When you have that sort of
that's
overwhelming evidence.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting, because recently I've heard that the judge did order an investigation of that jury after the trial, believing that perhaps one or two of them had been paid off prior to the trial. Unfortunately, that investigation didn't lead to anywhere.
Some years ago, I used to teach in a prison, and I wasn't in prison, but I taught in one. Which is actually a pretty good gig because, your students are always there. You never have an absence problem and all that. But the prisoners used to say, when it was a mantra with them, they would say, "Those without the capital get the punishment." And I would believe that, especially when it comes to hiring attorneys, with getting the best representation that you can get. And in this case, Durst had three of the best lawyers in Oh, yeah. Well, if Durst hadn't been
representing him,
if he hadn't come from a family with billions and personally had millions, then he would have been in jail. I mean, he never would have gotten out of Galveston. But
I would agree with that.
But the story you tell is captivating, and it is a wonderful read. And so I thank you for writing a marvelous book that reads like Sherlock Holmes. It's just, and I kept, like I told you, I was up last night 3 a.m. wanting to finish because it just pulls you right along, and you're waiting for someone to solve this thing, and still justice has not been served, so we wait.
And well, as it turns out, we're going to continue to wait. But thank you for those kind comments. It was, as you read, it's a very bizarre story. It's a compelling story, and it's one that we really haven't seen in quite a long time.
And what do you learn, having spent 15 years of your life working on this case, so to speak? What do you know about what law enforcement could do better? I think you make a real good case for the police doing all they could under the circumstances of their times. So there's no criticism there, but still there's always things to learn. So what would you say there is to learn from this case for future cases going forward?
Well, actually, there's no criticism towards the cops or the detectives that were on the ground doing the investigating. There's a lot of criticism, though, towards one particular official, Janine Pirro, who was the Westchester County District Attorney and who had a very big role in the HBO documentary, and who continues to this day, publicize her role in all of this, a role that she basically created out of thin air, and her need for publicity really subverted this case in a way where the other jurisdictions, I mean, she's looking at one case, you got Galveston looking at their case, you've got Los Angeles looking at the murder of Susan Burman, and then you've got another jurisdiction or two other jurisdictions in Northern California looking into two other missing women who Durst could possibly be connected to. none of them wanted to deal with Jeanine Pirro, fearing that anything that they told her would end up in the press. So the one thing that I did learn, and I've covered law enforcement for years, and when they work well, they're great. Which there's one book I wrote called A Beautiful Child, in which federal and local law enforcement, it was seamless, and they were able to arrest this perpetrator. Unfortunately, in this story, it's, I think law enforcement just could not work together because of one prosecutor, and that was unfortunate. And
I like that
I took.
I like that you said she never met a camera she didn't like.
Yeah, she did it, and even to this day, I mean, she hosts a program every week on the Fox network, and she continues to tell the world that she's the one that started this investigation, and that she was going to interview. Her office had set up an interview with Susan Burman before she was murdered, and that never happened.
None of it's true.
And I think that once this case does go to trial, particularly in Los Angeles with the Susan Burman murder, she's going to get called on the carpet, and I think the record's going to reflect that a lot of things that she's been saying are just untrue. And that's unfortunate, because there's a lot of good police work in this, and there are a lot of good people within law enforcement who have been working on this, and they tend to get overshadowed by someone like a Pirro.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time. I've got about 30 seconds, so I've got to wrap it up. Once again, the book is The Bizarre and Chilling Story of Robert Durst, The Deadly Secret. I highly recommend it. Pick it up today. You'll read well into the night, by Matt Burbeck. Thanks, Matt. Enjoyed talking to you. So once again, this has been Dr. W.F. Strong for Good Books Radio. Here's hoping that all your books will be good reads.